Every camera, every push alert, and every major outlet this week has been pointed at southern Japan, and for good reason. But while the world was watching Kumamoto, a very different, much smaller earthquake story was quietly unfolding on the other side of the Pacific, in Northern California, within about a day of Japan's disaster. I want to cover both of these properly today, because understanding what happened in Japan actually helps explain why what happened in California matters less than you might assume, and why the two are not connected the way it might feel like they should be. Let's start with Japan, because that's the story that deserves the fuller treatment first. On Tuesday, July 28th at 4:27 in the afternoon local time, a powerful earthquake struck Kumamoto Prefecture on the southern Japanese island of Kyushu. The Japan Meteorological Agency's preliminary reading put it at magnitude 7.1, while the U.S. Geological Survey's independent analysis came in a bit lower at magnitude 6.8. That kind of gap between Japanese and American agencies isn't unusual and doesn't mean either side got it wrong. Different agencies use different methods and different seismic networks to calculate magnitude. And for a shallow, complex earthquake like this one, a few tenths of a point of disagreement between two respected agencies is completely normal. What both agencies agreed on was the intensity of the shaking itself. The quake registered a 7 on Japan's Shindo scale, which is the maximum possible reading on that scale, and it struck at a shallow depth of only around 10 kilometers, a little over 6 miles down, which is exactly the kind of depth that makes shaking feel far more violent at the surface than a deeper earthquake of the same size would. The human toll has been climbing since the earthquake struck, and I want to give you the most current figures rather than the ones that were reported in the first few hours, because this is exactly the kind of disaster where the death toll typically rises as rescue crews reach more affected areas. As of the most recent reporting, at least 18 people have been confirmed dead, including at least one foreign national, with many more injured or still unaccounted for as search and rescue work continues around the clock. Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi has been leading the government's response directly, describing it as a race against time to find anyone still trapped. One of the most dramatic images to come out of this disaster is the Aeon Mall in the city of Kashima in Kumamoto Prefecture. The mall was evacuated the moment the earthquake struck, but shortly afterward, what's believed to have been a gas leak triggered an explosion inside the building, and part of the ceiling caved in. Rescue crews have been searching the wreckage ever since, and as of the latest updates, at least 3 people connected to the mall have died, with several more still missing. A 74-year-old man who was at a supermarket just a few blocks from the mall when the quake hit later told reporters he genuinely thought he was going to die in that moment, which gives you some sense of just how violent the shaking felt on the ground, even away from the buildings that ultimately failed. The Japanese government's emergency earthquake warning system, which pushes automated alerts to phones and broadcasts seconds before strong shaking arrives at a given location, activated across a wide stretch of southern Japan, with warnings issued for Kumamoto, Nagasaki, Kagoshima, Fukuoka, Saga, Oita, and Miyazaki prefectures, essentially covering the entire southern island of Kyushu at once. That system is part of why, despite how violent the shaking was, the death toll, while genuinely tragic, hasn't climbed into the scale of some of Japan's worst historical earthquakes. Advance warning, even just a few seconds of it, gives people time to drop and take cover or step away from the most dangerous parts of a building before the strongest shaking actually arrives. It's worth explaining the Shindo scale for a second too, since you'll see it referenced constantly in Japanese earthquake coverage, and it measures something a little different from the magnitude number everyone's used to hearing. Magnitude describes the total energy released at the earthquake's source, a single number that doesn't change no matter where you're standing. Shindo, by contrast, is Japan's own scale for describing how strongly shaking is actually felt at a specific location, running from 0 up to a maximum of 7, and it's a lot like the modified Mercalli intensity scale used elsewhere in the world. Kumamoto Prefecture registering the maximum possible Shindo 7 tells you that, at least in the hardest hit spots, this was about as violent as shaking gets, even though the broader magnitude number describing the earthquake's overall size, whether you use Japan's 7.1 or the USGS's 6.8, is a separate measurement entirely. Roughly 300,000 people across Kumamoto Prefecture were instructed to evacuate to shelters in the immediate aftermath, and Japan's self-defense forces deployed approximately 3,600 personnel to affected areas as part of the government's emergency task force. Kumamoto Airport suspended all flights shortly after the quake, and Japan's Nuclear Regulation Authority confirmed in an emergency update that no abnormalities had been detected at nuclear facilities in the region, which is always one of the first things checked after a major earthquake in Japan given the country's history. The earthquake also triggered a tsunami advisory for the Ariake Sea and the Yatsushiro Sea, the two bodies of water bordering the affected coastline, warning of possible waves up to about 1 meter, roughly 3 feet. That advisory was lifted within about an hour, and no significant tsunami damage was reported. I want to specifically address something a lot of people searched for in the hours after this earthquake: whether Hawaii or the U.S. West Coast needed to worry about a tsunami from this event. The Pacific Tsunami Warning Center in Honolulu was clear and quick about this. There was no tsunami threat to Hawaii or American Samoa from this earthquake, and by extension, none to the west coast of North America either. It's worth explaining why, because the reason connects directly to something I've talked about in earlier videos on this channel. This was a shallow, inland earthquake striking within Kyushu itself, on a system of crustal faults, not an offshore megathrust earthquake along a subduction zone. Subduction zone earthquakes, where one tectonic plate is diving beneath another out under the ocean, are the kind capable of displacing enormous volumes of water and sending a tsunami racing across an entire ocean basin. A good real-world comparison is the magnitude 8.8 earthquake that struck off Russia's Kamchatka Peninsula almost exactly a year before this one, in July of 2025. That was a genuine subduction megathrust event, and it triggered tsunami warnings across the entire Pacific Basin, reaching Japan, Hawaii, Alaska, and the full length of the U.S. West Coast, with real waves eventually arriving on shorelines thousands of miles from where it started. This week's Kumamoto earthquake was a completely different animal, a shallow DOS, land-based rupture that could produce dangerous local shaking and a modest local tsunami advisory for its own immediate coastline, but that never had the physical capacity to send a wave anywhere near as far as Hawaii, let alone across the Pacific to California. The fault system responsible for this earthquake also has real history behind it. Kumamoto sits at the southern end of Japan's median tectonic line, the country's longest fault system, and this week's earthquake ruptured sections of two specific faults within that system: the roughly 81-kilometer Hinagu Fault and the 64-kilometer Futagawa Fault to its north, with a 27-kilometer stretch of the Futagawa Fault slipping as much as 3.5 meters. If the name Kumamoto sounds familiar from earthquake news before, that's not a coincidence. The same general fault system produced a well-known deadly sequence of earthquakes back in April of 2016, when a magnitude 6.24 shock was followed 2 days later by a magnitude 7.0 main shock on essentially the same fault zone. A decade later, that same stretch of crust has ruptured again, which is a sobering but not especially surprising reminder that a fault capable of producing a major earthquake once remains capable of doing it again, sometimes within the span of a single generation. Japanese officials have also been direct about the ongoing risk in the immediate aftermath, with one official noting plainly that because this week's earthquake occurred at such a shallow depth, that shallowness itself is a sign that this particular stretch of fault has a history of frequent rupture, and that further strong earthquakes in the area remain a real possibility in the coming days. That's not a prediction of a specific future event, the same way I've explained aftershock forecasting in earlier videos on this channel. It's an honest acknowledgement that a freshly ruptured shallow fault zone doesn't necessarily go quiet right away. I also want to acknowledge something directly, because regular viewers of this channel will recognize the pattern. This has been a genuinely active stretch for major earthquake headlines worldwide. Venezuela's devastating twin earthquakes back in June, the magnitude 7.3 that struck southern Mexico and was felt across Guatemala in mid-July, the magnitude 5.0 that rattled the Texas Panhandle just days ago, and now Kumamoto. That's 4 separate newsworthy earthquakes across 4 different countries within about 5 weeks. As I've explained in detail in an earlier video, that kind of clustering across entirely different unconnected tectonic plate boundaries isn't evidence of some hidden global pattern. It's simply what a planet that produces roughly 100 or more magnitude, 4.5 plus earthquakes every single week, looks like when several of the bigger ones happen to land in the same stretch of the news cycle. I'm not going to spend more time re-debunking that here, but if this is the first video of mine you're watching, it's worth knowing that connecting distant earthquakes into a single unified story is a really common instinct that the actual seismology just doesn't support. Now, let's talk about California, because this is the part of the story that's genuinely been overshadowed, and understandably so, given the scale of what's happening in Japan. About 19 hours after the Kumamoto earthquake struck, at 7:40 in the evening Pacific time on that same Tuesday, a magnitude 4.3 earthquake struck near Cloverdale in Northern California's Sonoma County, part of the North Bay region north of San Francisco. The epicenter was located about 8 kilometers, roughly 5 miles east-southeast of Cloverdale, at a depth of about 5.5 kilometers. It was a moderate earthquake by California standards, and it was felt clearly. More than 520 people submitted reports to the USGS's Did You Feel It system, describing shaking in Healdsburg, Geyserville, Harsh, Middletown, Kelseyville, and a number of more distant communities as well. No damage was reported. What happened next is the part that makes this feel like more of a story than a single moderate earthquake usually would. That magnitude 4.3 was followed by more than 160 aftershocks in the hours that followed, including a magnitude 2.5 that struck only about 38 seconds later. Through the overnight hours and into the next morning, additional small earthquakes continued to show up in the area, including a magnitude 1.0 micro-earthquake near Redwood Valley around 4:40 a.m. Wednesday. None of this rises to the level of damage or serious concern on its own, but a swarm of this size in a single region, over a matter of hours, is exactly the kind of thing that gets people's attention, especially when it's happening less than a day after a much larger, deadlier earthquake made international headlines on the other side of the ocean. I want to explain why this particular stretch of California is prone to exactly this kind of activity, because it's not random. Northern California's Mendocino County and Sonoma County region sits near what geologists call the Mendocino Triple Junction, one of the most tectonically complicated spots on the entire west coast of North America. It's the point where three major tectonic features meet at once: the San Andreas Fault, which is the transform boundary responsible for most of California's famous earthquake risk; the Mendocino Fracture Zone, a separate transform fault running out into the Pacific; and the southern end of the Cascadia Subduction Zone, the same subduction system I've covered in an earlier video that stretches north from here all the way to Vancouver Island. Having three major fault systems converge in roughly the same area makes this one of the most seismically active stretches of the entire west coast, and swarms of small to moderate earthquakes are a genuinely normal, expected feature of living in this specific corner of California, not a sign that something unusual is brewing. It's also worth noting that this region has had a more active stretch than usual even before this week. Back on June 24th, a magnitude 5.6 earthquake struck near Ukiah, in the same general part of Northern California, just over a month before this week's Cloverdale sequence. Two moderate earthquakes in roughly the same broader region within about 5 weeks of each other is worth noting, and it's the kind of thing seismologists will keep an eye on. But it's not unprecedented for an area this seismically active, and it doesn't by itself indicate that a larger earthquake is imminent. Small and moderate earthquakes happen here regularly precisely because of how tectonically busy this specific junction is. I also want to directly address the elephant in the room, because I guarantee some of you are wondering it. Does the Japan earthquake have anything to do with California starting to shake less than a day later? The honest, scientifically grounded answer is no, and it's worth explaining exactly why. The same way I've walked through this kind of question in other videos on this channel. The distance between Kumamoto, Japan, and Cloverdale, California is roughly 5,500 miles, spanning the entire width of the Pacific Ocean. The amount of stress one earthquake can meaningfully transfer onto a fault elsewhere fades out within a range of a few kilometers at the low end, and at most, a few hundred kilometers even for the largest earthquakes on the planet. There is no established, peer-reviewed physical mechanism by which an earthquake in Kyushu could reach across an entire ocean basin and trigger fault activity in Northern California within less than a day. What connects these two stories isn't geology, it's timing, and the fact that the planet produces earthquakes constantly, all the time, on completely independent fault systems all over the world. Somewhere in the range of 100 or more earthquakes of magnitude 4.5 or greater happen globally every single week. A major, deadly earthquake in Japan and a moderate, harmless swarm in California landing within the same 24-hour window isn't evidence of a connection. It's simply what it looks like when two entirely separate, entirely normal seismic processes happen to overlap on the calendar. I'll go a step further, because there's actually a second layer to this same point worth addressing. In that same general 24 to 48-hour window, a handful of other small earthquakes also occurred elsewhere in California. A magnitude 2.5 near Carlsbad in San Diego County, a magnitude 2.8 near Lamont in Kern County, and a small magnitude 1.9 near Ridgecrest, out in the Mojave Desert. None of these are connected to the Cloverdale sequence either. Carlsbad, Lamont, Ridgecrest, and Cloverdale are all hundreds of miles apart from each other, sitting on entirely different segments of California's fault network. California is simply a seismically active state, with multiple independent fault systems producing small earthquakes essentially every single day, somewhere within its borders. Seeing several of them listed together in the same news cycle can create an illusion of a statewide pattern that the actual seismology doesn't support. Each of these earthquakes needs to be understood on its own terms, tied to its own specific local fault system, rather than lumped together into one narrative just because they happen to show up on the same earthquake list in the same week. So what's the actual useful takeaway from all of this? For Japan, the situation remains a genuine active disaster, and it deserves your attention on its own terms, not as a curiosity attached to a California story. Rescue operations are ongoing. The death toll is likely to continue climbing as crews reach more areas. And Japanese officials have explicitly warned that further earthquakes remain possible in the affected region, given how shallow this week's rupture was. If you want to help or stay informed, following established Japanese and international relief organizations directly is going to give you more accurate, useful information than second-hand summaries. And it's worth being cautious of any online fundraising appeal that surfaces quickly after a disaster like this without a verifiable, established track record behind it. For California, the practical takeaway is much more mundane, and that's actually the point. A magnitude 4.3 followed by a swarm of smaller aftershocks in a historically active corner of the state is a real, felt event. But it's not a departure from how this specific stretch of California normally behaves. If you're in the North Bay region and this rattled your nerves a little, that's a completely reasonable reaction to genuinely feeling the ground move. And it's a fine moment to do the basic things that are always worth doing in earthquake country, rather than only after something happens. Check that heavy furniture. And bookshelves are anchored to the wall, make sure your water heater is strapped down, and know the lowest, most interior room in your home in case you ever need it in a hurry. If you haven't checked whether Shake Alert, the West Coast's earthquake early warning system, is actually enabled. On your phone, this is as good a moment as any to look, since it's built into most modern phones but isn't always confirmed to be switched on. And if you've been putting off looking into separate earthquake insurance, since standard homeowners and renters policies typically don't cover earthquake damage on the West Coast, any more than they do in Texas or the Pacific Northwest, a week like this one is a reasonable prompt to actually look into it rather than another headline to scroll past. It's also worth remembering the basic mechanics of what to actually do if you ever feel shaking like this yourself. Since a lot of people go years in California without ever practicing it, the moment you feel the ground move, drop to your hands and knees before you try to walk anywhere, since strong shaking can knock you off your feet. Get under a sturdy table or desk if one's nearby. And if there isn't one, cover your head and neck with your arms instead. Hold on to whatever you're sheltering under, since the shaking itself can shift furniture around the room. If you're outside when it happens, move away from buildings, trees, and power lines rather than running toward a doorway, which is outdated advice that's less safe than simply getting into the open. And if you want a structured way to actually practice this rather than just reading about it, the Great Shakeout Earthquake Drill runs every October across California and much of the West Coast. And it's a genuinely useful, free way to walk through the basics as a household or workplace before you ever need them for real. I think the honest, complete picture here is this. 2 real earthquakes happened on opposite sides of the same ocean within about a day of each other. One of them a genuine, ongoing human tragedy in southern Japan, and the other a moderate, well-explained seismic swarm in a part of California that produces exactly this kind of activity on a fairly regular basis. They don't need to be connected to, both be worth understanding properly, and treating them as 2 separate stories, each grounded in its own local geology, is a more accurate and ultimately more useful way to think about this week than searching for a single dramatic thread tying them together. It's a good general habit to carry into any week where multiple earthquake headlines show up close together. Honestly, ask what's actually happening in each specific place, on each specific fault, before assuming the timing itself means something it doesn't. I'll keep following the recovery effort in Kumamoto as new information comes in, and I'll keep an eye on whether the Northern California swarm continues to taper off the way aftershock sequences typically do. If anything changes meaningfully on either front, I'll have an update. Stay informed, follow official sources on both sides of the Pacific for anything real-time, and I'll see you in the next one.